Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really critical mission.
We are.
We're going to do a deep dive into the recent diplomatic acceleration that was attempting to end the conflict in Ukraine.
And this wasn't some standard, slow-moving process.
No, not at all. This was a sudden, very high-stakes diplomatic intervention. And it was all centered around a specific, and I have to say, highly contentious 28-point peace proposal drafted in the United States.
Right, and this draft, it forced Kyiv and its European partners into this immediate, almost frantic scramble to rewrite the terms of what was, for many of them, a completely unacceptable deal.
So what are we working with today? What's our source material look like?
Our sources really pull back the curtain on this whole process. We have a detailed analysis of that initial U.S. framework. I mean, the specific provisions that sent shockwaves through capitals from Kyiv all the way to Paris. And alongside that, we have Ukraine's very calculated, very strategic response. We also have the robust European counter-proposals that came out of that response, and some really crucial context from previous failed negotiations, like the ones back in Istanbul in 2022.
And there's more.
Yeah. We also explore let's say, the darker side of the conflict, the crucial context of information warfare, and the very different scenarios for the future of the conflict as seen by those closest to the fighting.
So our goal today is not just to summarize these events. We really need to unpack them. We're going to dissect the highly transactional and, frankly, sometimes insulting provisions of this initial 28-point plan.
Exactly.
We'll identify exactly why it caused such a shock, not just in Kyiv, but really across the entire NATO alliance.
And I think most importantly, we need to define those immovable red lines. We're talking territory, security, and justice.
The big three.
The big three. And these are the things that make achieving what everyone calls a just and lasting peace so immensely difficult for every single party involved.
So let's get into it. Let's unpack this high-pressure diplomatic moment, #II, the diplomatic catalyst and competing formulas. Okay, so the genesis of this entire diplomatic firestorm, it really lies in the nature of the U.S. initiative itself.
It does.
Our sources describe it as a decisive and highly transactional effort. And it seemed to be focused almost entirely on velocity. They wanted speed.
Speed above all else. And this process, as our sources detail, it involved non-traditional channels.
Right, not your usual diplomat.
Not at all. We're talking about U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and maybe most notably a major Russian figure, Kirill Dmitriev.
So this was not the standard fare of, foreign ministries talking across big conference tables.
No, this was back-channel diplomacy on overdrive. And the aggressive timeline, that tells you everything you need to know about the priorities.
What was the timeline?
The sources confirm an incredibly aggressive target deadline. Initially, it was set for the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. And this kind of velocity, this demand for a quick deal is just so dangerous. It inherently risks compelling the weaker party in the negotiation, in this case, Ukraine, to accept immediate, massive concessions.
Before they've even had time to think.
Exactly. Before they have time to fully calculate the long-term implications for their security, their sovereignty, and frankly, their accountability to their own people.
And this immediate reaction to the draft's content, coupled with these unusual back channels, it must have generated immense controversy about where this plan even came from.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just what was proposed, but whose voice it seemed to carry.
What do you mean?
Well, there were immediate reports suggesting the U.S. draft drew heavily, maybe too heavily, from an earlier Russian document, one that was given to the Trump administration back in October.
That's a huge problem.
It is. And independent analysts pointed out that significant chunks of the text, they read like a non-native English translation, which suggests heavy input, or at least influence, from a Russian source, regardless of who ultimately typed up the final document.
So even though U.S. officials were insisting it was authored by the U.S. with input from both sides.
Right. Even with that insistence, the appearance of it being so overwhelmingly favorable to Moscow was just politically toxic from the very beginning.
The political shock inside the Beltway must have been immediate. How did this non-traditional gambit, how did it actually land, domestically and with the allies?
The fallout was instant and it was severe. The plan was immediately slammed by critics in Washington and in Europe. They called it a capitulation to Russia.
I remember that phrase.
Yeah, and some even called it nothing less than a Russian wish list.
So this internal political firestorm, it had real consequences.
A very significant, very visible consequence. It led to the resignation of Keith Kellogg,
the president's special representative for Russia and Ukraine.
The very same. His departure signaled this profound rift. because he felt his role and, the traditional diplomatic efforts had been completely superseded by Witkoff's non-traditional fast-track approach.
And this kind of diplomatic surprise, where your own allies feel completely sidelined, that has to be damaging.
Incredibly. It immediately alienated key U.S. partners and a lot of domestic policymakers who were, deeply concerned about the optics of rewarding aggression.
Now, to really understand the sheer magnitude of the gap this U.S. draft was trying to bridge, we have to look at the maximalist positions held by both sides. Let's start with Ukraine's 10-point formula. That's been Kyiv's diplomatic fortress for a while now.
It has, and Ukraine's position is fundamentally uncompromising on three core elements: territory, withdrawal, and justice.
Okay, break that down.
The 10-point formula, it demands a full cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of all Russian forces from sovereign Ukrainian land, and the restoration of internationally recognized borders.
And they've been very clear on that last point.
Very clear. They stress that territorial integrity is, quote, not up for negotiations.
And it's not just about military withdrawal.
No, it also insists on comprehensive justice for war crimes, prosecution of those responsible, and the immediate release of all prisoners and deportees, especially the children. They're demanding a full return to the status quo ante, plus accountability.
And then on the other side, you have Russia's baseline demands,
Yeah.
which, as you said, exist on a completely different planet.
A different planet, a different galaxy.
They're demanding not just a ceasefire, but these fundamental, irreversible changes to Ukraine's entire political and military structure.
That's right. Russia's demands, they start with the recognition of all occupied land, Crimea, Donbass, and the seized parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia as definitively Russian territory. For Moscow, this is completely non-negotiable.
Okay, that's number one.
Secondly, they demand permanent legal guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, ever. Thirdly, they require the lifting of all sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 and 2022.
And finally,
a severe curtailment of Ukraine's military strength. President Putin insists that any talks have to recognize and codify the current realities on the battlefield.
which is essentially demanding that the outcome of military conquest be accepted diplomatically.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what it is.
This inherent, just irreconcilable conflict over territory and security. It's compounded by the historical failure of the global institutions that are supposed to manage conflict. We're talking about the complete paralysis of third-party mediation.
Absolutely. The traditional body that's tasked with mediating these grand geopolitical crises is, of course, the UN Security Council, the UNSC.
But in a crisis where a permanent a P5 member, in this case Russia is the aggressor, the whole system just collapses.
It does. Our sources use this very succinct phrase for it. They refer to the situation as the UNSC having transformed into a UN Insecurity Council.
That's a powerful phrase. But let's elaborate for a moment on the specific systemic implications of that P5 paralysis. Why is that veto power so destructive in this particular conflict?
It's so destructive because the veto power grants legal impunity to a major aggressor within the very framework that was designed to ensure collective security. It's a paradox.
So Russia can just block any action against itself.
Precisely. Since Russia is legally empowered to veto any resolution, authorizing a comprehensive peacekeeping mission, or condemning its actions, or establishing a robust judicial body, the system fails its core mission.
And what does that mean for the conflict itself?
It means that international law, which was designed to uphold sovereignty and territorial integrity, the key issues here, it can't be enforced through its primary institutional channel. It forces mediation outside of international law and into the realm of transactional power politics.
Which is exactly what the U.S. draft tried to do.
Exactly what it tried to do.
And since that traditional route was completely blocked, other, let's say, less potent proposals emerged to fill that vacuum, notably from China.
Yes, China's 12-point peace document from March 2023. It was an attempt to enter the mediation space, but it was fundamentally flawed.
Flawed how?
Our sources highlight its vagueness. It lacked any specificity whatsoever on the key issues, like territorial disputes or concrete security guarantees for Ukraine. It essentially proposed peace without proposing any actual path to peace.
So if it wasn't a practical roadmap, what was China's actual strategic ambition with this vague document?
The analysis suggests its primary goal was less about solving the conflict and more about global optics.
Positioning themselves.
Right. Firstly, China aimed to impress the developing world to bolster Beijing's image as a responsible, non-aligned global power that's interested in stability.
And secondly,
Secondly, it was a direct political attempt to rebut the persistent Western accusations that China was acting as a silent accomplice to Moscow.
and how did the actual belligerents react?
Well, Moscow cautiously praised it because it sort of echoed their call for a ceasefire without preconditions.
Right.
But Kyiv and the West, they rejected it outright because without any actionable steps or commitments on withdrawal, it was just viewed as a way to enable Russian aggression by locking in their current gains. #2. Deep dive into the contentious U.S. 28-point proposal.
Okay, now we move to the centerpiece of this discussion, the 28-point U.S. proposal itself. If you're going to create a diplomatic solution that causes this much political friction, the content has to be extreme.
It does.
And indeed, some of these specific provisions, they cut directly across the foundational red lines of both Ukraine and NATO. Let's start with the biggest security question, the NATO veto.
This was Provision 3, a non-negotiable security concession demanded from Ukraine, and it contained two linked demands.
What were they?
First, Ukraine must legally enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO. This is a massive structural domestic change.
And the second part?
Second, and this is just as profound, the proposal demanded that NATO itself must codify a pledge never to admit Ukraine in the future.
So this isn't just a strategic concession. This effectively kneecaps the concept of Ukrainian sovereignty in perpetuity, right?
Precisely. This provision grants Moscow a permanent legal veto over Ukraine's sovereign choice of security alignment. It transforms Russia from an external adversary into an internal constitutional constraint on Kyiv.
Which is in direct conflict with NATO's core principles.
A direct fundamental conflict, specifically with the open door policy established all the way back in 1949, which states that membership is a sovereign decision made by the applicant and the existing members. No one else gets a say.
So how significant was the official reaction from NATO itself?
It was decisive. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte publicly and unequivocally rejected the idea that Russia should ever have a veto over who joins the alliance.
Because the precedent would be disastrous.
Absolutely. If NATO accepted this provision, it would signal to every nation on Russia's periphery, from Finland to Poland, that their sovereign choices could be curtailed by Moscow's military aggression.
And what did the European counterproposal do with this provision?
Our sources detail that their response to the U.S. draft was swift and brutal. They simply deleted this entire provision. They considered it an existential compromise on the entire European security architecture.
So since the draft blocked NATO membership, the proposal then tried to substitute that security with conditional U.S. guarantees.
It did.
But these guarantees, Provision 10, they were perceived as exceptionally weak and just full of loopholes.
The proposed reliable 10-year U.S. guarantee was, well, it was riddled with conditionality, which is exactly why it was immediately distrusted.
What were the conditions?
The guarantee would lapse entirely, meaning the U.S. would be relieved of its obligation if Ukraine were to invade Russia or launch a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause.
I have to pause there. Without cause. Given Russia's history of inventing pretexts for military action, claiming to protect Russian speakers, alleging biological weapons labs, how could Ukraine ever feel secure knowing that the guarantee could be dissolved based on a subjective, self-serving Russian provocation?
That is the core strategic failure of that provision. You've nailed it. It shifts the entire burden of strategic restraint and de-escalation overwhelmingly onto Kyiv.
It's a trap.
It's a huge trap. It risks invalidating the guarantee during any future Russian-incited border skirmishes, acts of sabotage, or hybrid warfare provocations, which we know Moscow excels at.
So it creates a security vacuum.
A vacuum where Ukraine is incentivized to ignore low-level aggression for fear of losing their guarantee entirely. And on top of all that, the transactional nature was just baffling. The U.S. would receive compensation for the guarantee.
A payment for securing an ally.
Yes. And this was seen as this jarring transactional element in what's supposed to be a strategic security agreement. It suggests the U.S. viewed it as a business deal rather than a mutual defense pact.
Okay, let's move to the physical constraints imposed on Ukraine, the military and territorial limitations. First, the force cap. The proposal aimed to significantly reduce the size of Ukraine's standing army.
Yes, the initial draft capped the Ukrainian armed forces at 600,000 personnel.
Now, 600,000 is still a sizable force.
It is, but it represents a very significant reduction from the estimated current mobilized strength, which analysts place somewhere between 800,000 and 900,000 active duty soldiers.
You're taking 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers off the line.
Immediately. Which strains Ukraine's ability to defend its newly secured territory and manage a long, heavily militarized line of contact. And Russia, of course, was pushing for a much more structured, phased demilitarization.
What were the specifics of that Russian-favored phased reduction? Because this is where the hard security details really become apparent.
The Russian vision was highly prescriptive. It really reflects a demand for strategic depth and predictability on their new western border. Phase 1, which they called stabilization, mandated that immediately after signing the agreement, the total force cap would be 600,000. Okay, but, and this is crucial, no more than 300,000 of those troops could be deployed within 100 kilometers of the line of contact.
So it creates a massive buffer zone.
A huge buffer zone, which hinders Ukraine's ability to fortify or launch rapid responses. And then Phase 2, which would take place over the following 2 years, would reduce the total forces even further to 300,000, with only 150,000 near the line of contact.
That reduction from potentially 900,000 down to 300,000 over 2 years, while at the same time losing a forward defensive zone, that effectively renders Ukraine militarily dependent on external guarantees, right?
Absolutely. The plan attempts to dismantle the effective military capacity Ukraine has built during the war.
And historically, that kind of thing doesn't end well.
No. Proposals that impose severe military limitations on the defeated or weaker party. I mean, you could think of the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on Germany's military after World War I. They often sow the seeds for future resentment and instability, not lasting peace. This structured reduction just codified Moscow's desire for strategic superiority on its border.
And then there's the issue everyone agrees is the most contentious territory. Provision 21 determined what Russia would officially gain from this aggression.
And this provision was the ultimate red line for Kyiv. It mandated that Ukraine and, critically, the United States recognize Russian control over Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk as de facto Russian territory.
And what about the other regions?
For Kherson and Zaporizhia, the proposal stipulated that the lines would be frozen along the line of contact, meaning the current front lines would become the recognized de facto border.
So this isn't just a ceasefire line. It's international acknowledgement of territory seized by force.
It is international diplomatic acceptance of conquest. And this clause instantly drew immense criticism because it institutionalizes the gain achieved through illegal aggression. It just flies in the face of Zelensky's consistent pledge that Ukraine will never formally cede territory.
And the implication for global stability is huge.
It's massive. It means that military might, when used decisively, can override international law and the sovereignty of a neighbor.
Moving away from the military and territorial limits, let's address two provisions that really struck at the heart of justice and global finance. The first is Provision 26, the shocking inclusion of full amnesty.
This provision called for a full judicial amnesty for their actions during the war for all parties involved, Ukrainian and Russian alike.
All parties.
All parties. And this provision created an immediate and profound crisis of accountability. It directly contradicts Ukraine's foundational demand for justice, particularly for all the documented war crimes and atrocities committed against civilians.
Why is this provision so fundamentally corrosive to any chance of lasting peace?
Because a peace that grants amnesty for mass atrocities isn't justice, it's just impunity. Our sources draw a very strong parallel to historical precedents here.
Such as?
Well, critics argue that such a blanket amnesty would ruin international norms regarding accountability. It establishes a moral hazard that rewards aggression.
It's a green light for future aggressors.
Exactly. The very foundation of modern international criminal law, built on the necessity of the post-World War II Nuremberg Tribunal, rests on the principle that there can be no peace without accountability for war crimes. By offering amnesty, the U.S. proposal implied that the goal of speed trumped the goal of justice.
Then there is the financial angle, Provision 14, regarding the frozen Russian assets, which had this distinctly transactional U.S.-centric flavor that truly rankled European allies.
This proposal outlined a plan for the estimated $300 to $350 billion in frozen Russian central bank reserves. Provision 14 specifically suggested that $100 billion of these frozen assets would be invested in U.S.-led efforts for Ukrainian reconstruction.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable on the surface.
But the stunning detail was the condition. The U.S. would manage the endeavor and receive a disproportionate share, 50% of the profits generated from this venture.
50% of the profits. That is an extraordinary piece of transactionalism leveraging reconstruction efforts as a profit-making opportunity during a security crisis. How did European allies react to this?
They were, to put it mildly, absolutely furious. They saw this profit-sharing structure as insulting to Ukraine, and they heavily contested it. They viewed it as the U.S. positioning itself to profit from a war that primarily impacted Europe.
And Europe was expected to contribute as well.
Yes, compounding this, the plan stipulated that Europe would add its own $100 billion to the reconstruction fund while being expected to unfreeze its own remaining Russian funds. So they were essentially taking on financial burden without the profit-sharing benefit.
It sounds like a clear attempt by Washington to use a security crisis for domestic financial and political gain.
That's certainly how it was perceived in many European capitals.
And how did Moscow view this whole discussion around utilizing their frozen central bank assets?
For Moscow, any discussion around utilizing their frozen reserves is a massive strategic red line. They regard the entire act of potential seizure or profitable utilization as an act of expropriation.
One that normalizes taking a major power's sovereign assets.
Precisely. This precedent, regardless of the justification, significantly undermines global trust in the international financial system for all non-Western states. It's prompting central banks worldwide to accelerate their diversification away from Western currencies like the dollar.
So Russia's demand is simple.
Very simple. All reserves must be unfrozen and returned as a condition of restoring any long-term diplomatic trust. #3 Kyiv's strategic countermaneuver and the revised plan.
So the initial U.S. draft was so politically poisonous that it could have caused a massive rift between Ukraine and its most critical partner.
Yep.
Yet President Zelensky and his government, they couldn't just reject it out of hand.
No, they had to perform a very high-risk diplomatic balancing act.
What was the feeling inside Kyiv?
The internal shock was immense. Many there feared the plan required Ukraine to, in their words, vacate Donbas without a fight in diplomatic terms. But despite that, Zelensky chose a path of calculated engagement. Because the government correctly identified that risking a full diplomatic break with the United States was a greater danger than working diligently behind closed doors to amend the draft's most egregious elements. The leverage was enormous, and they knew they had to manage it very carefully.
So in engaging, what were the immediate, non-negotiable red lines that Zelensky established to guide his negotiating team?
His diplomatic red lines were very firm and very public. First, robust security guarantees. Second, upholding sovereignty. And third, protecting territorial integrity.
And he had a clear message for Russia.
He did. He emphasized that Russia must not get rewards for its aggression on Ukraine. And crucially, he insisted that security guarantees couldn't be a bilateral deal just with the U.S.
He wanted more partners involved.
He demanded the involvement of Europeans and the broader coalition of the willing to ensure institutional and long-term assurance that mirrored the Article 5 guarantee of NATO.
And this careful engagement by Kyiv, it gave European allies the necessary political cover to launch their own forceful pushback. Why were Europeans so concerned about this U.S. initiative?
European capitals were deeply worried about being marginalized and exposed. There was a palpable sense among some leaders that the U.S. initiative risked sacrificing Ukraine's security and Europe's in the process.
By doing what exactly?
By granting Moscow a NATO veto and by offering these weak, conditional U.S. guarantees that might just disappear in a future crisis. The fear was unilateralism by America, which compelled European leaders to coordinate their response very aggressively.
So what was the tangible result of this collective pushback and diplomatic pressure on Washington?
The result was the revised, refined 19-point plan. And the fact that the plan shrunk from 28 points to 19 suggests a significant deletion of the hardest, most Russia-friendly provisions.
And Zelensky was more positive about this version.
Yes, President Zelensky publicly noted the progress. He stated the revised framework looks better and offered a better chance now than ever to reach a deal. So this 19-point plan, it really represents Kyiv and Europe successfully mitigating the existential threats that were contained within that original U.S. document.
Let's hone in again on the financial aspect, the frozen Russian assets. How did the European counterproposal fundamentally change the ethical and financial use of that money compared to the U.S. profit-sharing scheme?
The European position was a complete overhaul of Provision 14. They took a firm, legal, and non-transactional stance.
Which was?
They insisted that Russian sovereign assets will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine.
That is a crucial difference.
It's night and day. It immediately eliminated the U.S. profit-sharing structure and shifted the focus from a U.S.-led investment venture to direct compensation for damages inflicted on Ukraine.
So it legally ties the funds to Russia's obligation to pay.
Exactly. It ties the funds directly to Russia's obligation to pay for reconstruction, rather than simply being a source of profit for the intermediary.
Finally, let's address one of the most destabilizing elements of that original draft. Provision 25, the logistical trap of forced elections.
This provision required Ukraine to hold free and fair elections within an impossibly short window, just 100 days after the agreement signing.
100 days?
Yes. And this timeline was viewed by security and political experts as completely unfeasible and potentially catastrophic for Ukrainian democracy.
Unpack that logistical challenge for us. Why is 100 days so unrealistic, especially after a major ceasefire?
Well, it's because of the sequencing that's required. Before any elections can safely or legally occur, massive territorial withdrawals and troop movements need to be completed.
Which are complex and dangerous in themselves.
Militarily complex, incredibly difficult, and fraught with the potential for renewed conflict. So after all that, you're left with maybe only 30 to 60 days for genuine political mobilization, voter registration, and campaign activity.
In a country that's been at war.
Exactly. You have a country under martial law facing massive internal displacement. I mean, millions of refugees are currently outside the country or internally displaced, and it's still struggling with ongoing corruption crises. Holding legitimate elections under those conditions is nearly impossible.
So they would be non-representative.
Highly non-representative and incredibly vulnerable to external influence.
So the U.S. plan appeared to prioritize the political win, the narrative of a rapid return to democracy, over the sustainable reality of democratic restoration.
Absolutely. The pressure cooker scenario in that original draft suggests the U.S. prioritized the appearance of a quick political victory for the broker, rather than prioritizing a genuine, stable, and sustainable democratic transition in Ukraine.
And the European counterproposal fixed this.
Wisely, yes. It recognized this inadequacy and suggested a much more flexible approach. It eliminated the rigid 100-day deadline and proposed that elections occur as soon as possible under monitored, stable conditions. A much more realistic approach. #CE, persisting disagreements and geopolitical implications.
So despite the success in revising that initial toxic draft into a cleaner 19-point framework, the core issue preventing any final resolution remains the intractable conflict over territory. The compromise just hasn't been found.
That territorial gulf is the absolute immovable object, and it's where the negotiations continuously stall.
Russia's position hasn't changed.
Not an inch. Russia continues to demand the formal international recognition of its claims over the 4 annexed regions and Crimea as a precondition for any meaningful discussion on peace.
While Ukraine maintains its position based on international law.
Right. Ukraine insists that only it can make decisions regarding its territory, and it's supported by Article 2 of the UN Charter.
So even if Kyiv agreed to a ceasefire based on the current line of contact, they cannot and will not formalize that recognition. What's the real difference between acknowledging a de facto line and granting formal recognition?
The distinction is absolutely critical. A de facto ceasefire line is a temporary military boundary. It's recognized purely for the purpose of stopping the fighting, without prejudice to the final political settlement.
The pause button.
Exactly. But formal recognition, that's a permanent legal cession of sovereignty. It validates Russia's annexations internationally. And Zelensky has repeatedly ruled that out because he understands that doing so undermines Ukraine's future leverage and sacrifices the core principle of territorial integrity.
And the stakes of these discussions, they go far beyond Ukraine's borders. They're redefining the geopolitical order. The initial U.S. proposal, even though it was revised, has left a negative mark on alliance principles.
The fallout is substantial. The mere attempt to codify limits on NATO expansion, essentially creating a legal mechanism to give Moscow a veto, it fundamentally undermined the core principle of self-determination that anchors the alliance's open-door policy.
So even though the provision was deleted?
Even so, the fact that a primary NATO member was willing to even float that idea sends a message globally that the alliance's foundational rules might be flexible under pressure.
And how has Europe reacted to the perceived unilateralism and the conditionality that was embedded in those weak U.S. security guarantees?
The effect is profound. It has forced European leaders to operate under the assessment that America is becoming an unreliable ally.
That's a strong statement.
It is, but it's what our sources indicate. The conditional nature of the U.S. guarantee compels Europe to accelerate strengthening its own defense capabilities. We're seeing real discussions in Europe about increasing defense spending significantly, maybe even exceeding 3% of GDP.
And creating their own security structures.
A greater reliance on finding internal European solutions. This push also involves establishing a dedicated coalition of the willing to provide robust institutional security assurances for Ukraine that explicitly mirror NATO's Article 5, which removes their reliance on a potentially conditional future U.S. commitment.
And this all circles back to the core challenge to global stability. What precedent is set if a final deal, either tacitly or explicitly, recognizes de facto Russian territorial control?
It risks establishing a global precedent that territorial conquest achieved by force is internationally accepted. This fundamentally contravenes the spirit and the letter of Article 2 of the UN Charter.
Which prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity.
Exactly. Should this deal be accepted globally, it essentially opens the door for other revisionist states, China regarding Taiwan, or Russia and other post-Soviet states like Georgia, to feel emboldened.
Emboldened to think they can secure strategic gains through military aggression.
And eventually see those gains codified by the international community. It's a very dangerous path.
Now, let's pivot for a moment to the potential economic uplift if a ceasefire were to actually occur. What would be the immediate economic benefits for Europe and the long-term potential for Ukraine?
Well, the economic forecasts are generally positive for Europe in the event of a durable peace. The immediate impact would be reduced geopolitical uncertainty, which would lead to lower energy prices, particularly natural gas.
And that has a knock-on effect.
A huge one. It boosts consumer confidence across the Eurozone. Reduced risk encourages investment and discretionary consumption, which helps stabilize inflation and accelerate the recovery from the supply shocks of the last few years.
And the scale of reconstruction in Ukraine would clearly be monumental. It would generate massive global demand.
Absolutely monumental. The World Bank estimated the reconstruction cost for Ukraine at an astonishing $500 billion over the next decade.
$500 billion.
And this is not just aid. This is a massive multi-year economic driver. It would provide an enormous boost to key global industrial sectors: construction, materials like cement and copper, specialized chemicals, industrials.
Do we have any more specific numbers?
To put it in perspective, one banking estimate suggested that the rebuilding effort would require between 4 and 6 million tons of steel alone. That guarantees significant global industrial demand for years to come.
But let's circle back to the stability of the global financial system, particularly given that discussion about the potential seizure of Russian assets.
Right. While easing geopolitical tensions usually leads to a correction in risk assets, like a temporary dip in gold prices, the structural problem highlighted by the war remains.
Which is?
The precedent set by freezing a major country's sovereign reserves. It has fundamentally altered the risk assessment for central banks worldwide, especially those in emerging markets. They have witnessed that dollar-denominated assets can be weaponized.
So even with peace, the move away from the dollar continues.
Yes. The long-term trend of central banks diversifying away from the dollar and into secure assets like gold is expected to continue and likely accelerate.
Driven by the desire to mitigate risk.
The desire to mitigate the risk of future asset expropriation. This structural shift in global reserve management is expected to maintain long-term demand for gold, regardless of any near-term peace deal. To fully grasp the immense pressure and frankly, the lack of diplomatic options facing Kyiv during these negotiations, we have to understand the security perspective from within Ukraine.
Right.
And we rely here on a very sober assessment generated by top Ukrainian security experts, surveyed by the GILBES organization.
Right.
And crucially, their analysis is driven overwhelmingly by military factors.
Oh, overwhelmingly.
At a 9-to-1 ratio over political factors. For them, it's about what happens on the battlefield.
So what does this expert view suggest is the most probable, realistic outcome for the conflict, setting aside all the overly optimistic peace proposals?
The most probable scenario, and this was assigned a 38% probability by these experts, is a protracted war of attrition with lowered intensity of hostilities due to draining out of resources on both sides.
So a long, grinding stalemate.
That is the grim reality. A long, grinding conflict characterized by resource exhaustion rather than any decisive military or diplomatic breakthrough, which highlights the inherent difficulty in achieving the U.S. goal of a speedy resolution.
And the second most probable scenario, hybrid World War III, is genuinely alarming.
Yeah.
And it's driven by a very specific assessment of Western behavior.
That scenario carries a 20% probability. And the driver is what the experts call Western nuclear self-deterrence.
Nuclear self-deterrence. Explain that.
The core thesis is that the West's immense fear of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons creates a strategic paralysis in responding effectively to conventional aggression. This paralysis, in turn, is perceived to embolden global aggressors by granting effective impunity to nuclear powers.
So the perception of Western timidity could actually fuel more conflict.
Dangerously so. The fear is that authoritarian regimes could conclude that obtaining nuclear weapons provides effective leverage against any meaningful international response, which could accelerate nuclear proliferation.
Okay, so let's consider the best-case scenario, the ceasefire. Is the assumption that a peace agreement is durable and lasting?
Absolutely not. According to the Ukrainian expert Analysts, even the most favorable ceasefire scenario, which was assigned only a tiny 2% probability, is viewed primarily as a peace trap.
A peace trap.
Yes. This scenario is seen as merely a temporary pause that Russia would exploit strategically.
How?
Russia would use the respite to reconstitute its forces, replenish material, and launch intensified hybrid warfare campaigns across Europe, targeting democracies with cyber attacks and political influence.
And on the ground.
They would capitalize on Western war fatigue and, critically, lock in the territorial gains secured during the conflict for what they see as the inevitable next phase of aggression.
So this analysis suggests that any current diplomatic agreement is viewed by Kyiv not as an end to the war, but merely as preparation for renewed conflict down the line.
That is the essential conclusion. The perception from those on the inside is that Russia is negotiating for a timeout, not for a peace.
Now, if negotiations are to be grounded in any semblance of fact, they have to constantly counter the Kremlin's long-term disinformation campaign, which seeks to justify the war. What are the key claims Russia uses to maintain its war narrative?
Well, Russia's main justification is the false claim that NATO is an aggressive threat forcing military expansion toward its borders.
A claim that's been around for decades.
It has, and our sources confirm the facts unequivocally counter this. NATO is a defensive alliance. Its expansion reflects the sovereign choice of nations seeking protection. And what's more, Russia itself signed multiple international agreements, like the Helsinki Accords, that explicitly uphold every country's right to choose its own security arrangements and alliances.
Which makes their current claim hypocritical and legally baseless.
Completely.
And Russia has persistently exaggerated the military damage inflicted on Ukrainian forces to maintain the narrative of inevitable victory back home.
The exaggeration is massive. For example, President Putin made this widely distributed claim that Russia had destroyed 18,000 armored vehicles since the Ukrainian counteroffensive began.
Which sounds unbelievable.
It is. The reality, according to independent military analysts, is that this figure is hugely inflated, and it's actually closer to Russia's own total documented vehicle losses since 2014.
And what about the tactical realities on the ground?
We see that Western-donated equipment, while expensive, has demonstrated a significantly better survival rate for its crew members than equivalent Russian equipment. And despite massive resource commitments, Russian combined arms offensives continue to struggle, suffering heavy losses for minimal progress, like in the prolonged, grinding battles around Avdiivka.
Finally, we need to detail the humanitarian concerns that stand in direct opposition to Russia's rhetoric of protecting people in the occupied territories. What evidence is there of actions that directly contravene this stated goal?
The documented evidence of Russian actions runs entirely contrary to their stated humanitarian goals. The first major issue involves the forced deportation of children.
The summer camps.
Exactly. Russia used these summer camps as a guise to take thousands of Ukrainian children for forced indoctrination, subjecting them to Russian propaganda and language schooling.
And this led to international action.
It led directly to the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for the Russian president and the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights for alleged war crimes related to the unlawful deportation of children. The establishment of simplified legal procedures for granting Russian citizenship to these children, it just suggests a permanent intent to erase their Ukrainian identity and prevent their return.
And the level of control exerted over the remaining civilian population, using social services and legal pressure, is equally severe.
It's a systematic attempt at forced integration. Russian authorities are forcing parents in occupied regions to register newborns immediately as Russian citizens.
And what if they refuse?
They're backed by the severe threat of having their parental rights revoked if they refuse. Furthermore, Russia is actively denying basic social services and healthcare pensions, disability payments, essential medical care to any Ukrainian unless they obtain a Russian passport.
So it's coercion.
It is a clear, coercive tactic designed to force citizenship and exert total administrative control over the population, and it entirely dismantles any claim of benevolent protection. #tag6. Conclusion and final thought.
So this deep dive has walked us through an incredibly intense diplomatic crisis. We've gone from the shocking initial U.S. 28-point proposal all the way to the revised, cleaner frameworks that were achieved through relentless pressure from Kyiv and its European allies.
It's been quite a journey.
And the core tension, as we've seen, is this pressure from Washington for a speedy transactional deal that brings immediate stability versus Kyiv's absolute non-negotiable red lines on territory, sovereignty, and justice.
And the diplomatic victory for Kyiv and Europe was significant. They successfully deleted the NATO veto provision, they strengthened the security demands to include a coalition, and they replaced that financially exploitative U.S. profit-sharing scheme with a system focused on direct compensation from frozen Russian assets.
But the big issues remain.
Yes. The final immovable objects still prevent a resolution. The status of annexed territory, the conditional nature of any meaningful security guarantees, and the issue of judicial amnesty for war crimes.
And Russia's reaction to the new plan.
As our sources noted, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov subsequently rejected the revised 19-point plan as unrealistic and not aligned with Moscow's interests, which suggests that the current diplomatic window may already be closing.
Which brings us back to a profound strategic dilemma. Our source material referenced those early negotiations in Istanbul back in 2022, where both Russia and Ukraine were reportedly willing to discuss concessions on post-war European security alignment.
Right, those talks failed.
They failed, partly due to Western encouragement for Ukraine to continue fighting. Now, if external partners had the persuasive ability to encourage Kyiv to fight on in 2022, this raises an essential and difficult question for you, our listener, to continue to explore.
A really difficult question.
What responsibility do external partners have now, given the grim geopolitical scenarios, predicting only a temporary peace before renewed aggression, in deciding when to push for negotiation versus continued escalated military support? It is a profound moral, financial, and strategic choice that defines the scope and duration of this war.
It's a choice where the stakes could not possibly be higher for the future of the entire international system.
Indeed. We'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.